That evening, while sorting through a box of old cassette tapes and CDs in the living room, Sophie found a small, unmarked case wedged between stacks of dusty jewel cases. The tape inside was labeled only with one word: Us. She held it up. "Mom, do you know what this is?" Elena squinted. Her breath caught. "I think that's the lullaby." Matthew looked up from his book. "What lullaby?" Sophie turned the tape over in her hand. "You said you sang to me once under the apple tree." Elena nodded slowly. "It was a song I wrote when you were a baby, but I never played it for anyone. I recorded it once, probably that tape." Sophie stood. "Let's listen." They dusted off the old stereo, slid in the cassette, and pressed play. The tape hissed softly, then the sound of a piano began. Hesitant, simple, but full of emotion. Then her mother's voice came through, younger, softer, laced with something between fear and wonder. "Little light in the quiet dark, you arrived and changed my heart. I don't know how to do this right, but I'll hold you through the night. If my voice should crack, if my hands should shake, know I'm learning you with each breath I take. You are not a weight I carry. You are the song I get to sing. And though I may not know the tune, I'll love you through everything." The tape faded out, and for a moment, none of them moved. Sophie blinked away tears. "You wrote that for me." Elena reached out and touched her daughter's hand. "You were the first thing I ever wrote that came from love instead of pain." Matthew stood quietly, then said, "We need to keep that somewhere safe." Sophie shook her head. "We need to share it." Later that night, she uploaded the song onto her laptop, cleaned the audio slightly, and shared it to her blog under the title, "The Song My Mother Almost Forgot to Sing." It didn't go viral, but the comments poured in. "This made me call my mom after 5 years of silence. I didn't know how much I needed this today. I'm crying. Thank you for sharing this piece of your history." Elena sat beside Sophie, reading each comment with her hand covering her heart. "You gave this song a voice," she whispered. "One I never believed it deserved." "No," Sophie said softly. "You did." And for the first time, Elena didn't question whether her story had worth. She simply let it be. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, a pale cream envelope with gold script tucked between bills and supermarket coupons. Sophie was the one who pulled it from the mailbox. She didn't recognize the return address, but something about the handwriting felt familiar. She opened it on the porch, sunlight pooling at her feet. Inside was an invitation card that read, "You are cordially invited to the 25th Annual Creative Women's Gala honoring women who have turned pain into power through the arts. Featured honoree, Elena Moore." Sophie stared. Her heart did a little stutter step. Elena Moore was not just a name on that card. It was her mother. She ran inside. Elena was elbow deep in flour, trying to perfect a pie crust. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "What's that?" Sophie handed her the invitation. Elena took one glance and froze. What? No, this can't be right." Matthew, walking in with fresh laundry, asked, "What can't be right?" Sophie replied, "Mom's being honored at an actual gala, in front of people for her song." "But I'm not a musician," Elena stammered. "I'm not even anything. I wrote a lullaby for my child, not an audience." Sophie stepped closer. "You wrote truth, and it resonated. That's art, Mom." Elena sat down at the table, stunned. "I can't do this." Matthew set the laundry down and took her hand. "You've done harder things than walk across a stage." Sophie smiled gently. "You once taught a crying 6-year-old how to tie her shoes while burning dinner and comforting a teething baby. You are that strong." Elena exhaled shakily. "What would I even say?" Sophie held up the locket around her neck. "Say what you've been saying to me. Just this time. Say it to the world." For a long moment, Elena didn't speak. Then slowly, she nodded. "I'll go," she said. "But only if you both come with me." Matthew saluted. "Wouldn't miss it." Sophie grinned. Already planning our outfits." They laughed, the room filled with more than flower dust and sunlight. For years, Elena had lived under the weight of invisibility, convinced her voice didn't matter. But now, the world had reached out, not with pity, but with recognition. Not for being perfect, but for being real. And she was ready. The week leading up to the gala was a whirlwind. Sophie insisted they go dress shopping, though Elena protested. "I'm not a gown person. I'm more of a jeans and flower on my shirt type." But Sophie wouldn't budge. "You're being honored. You are not wearing denim to that stage." So off they went, mother and daughter, into a boutique Sophie had always loved but Elena had never dared step foot in. As they entered, a sales assistant approached with a practiced smile. "Looking for something special?" Sophie answered before Elena could backpedal. "Yes, my mother is being honored at a gala. She's a songwriter." Elena blushed. "It's just one song." But the assistant's face lit up with sincere admiration. "That's incredible. Let me find something that makes you feel how the world already sees you." Elena tried on 6 dresses. One was too tight. One made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Another reminded her too much of her mother's Sunday dresses. Too stiff, too formal. Then came the 7th. It was a deep midnight. Blue. Simple but elegant, with soft chiffon sleeves and a V-shaped neckline. It flowed as she walked and shimmered subtly in the light. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see the tired woman who had doubted herself for years. She saw a woman who had survived. Sophie clasped her hands at her chest. "Mom, that's the one." Elena turned side to side, unsure. "It feels like someone else." "No," Sophie said gently. "It feels like the version of you that's been hiding. And now she's ready." Elena bought the dress, but the night before the gala, she almost didn't wear it. She laid it across the bed and stared at it, panic rising in her chest. What if she forgot her words? What if people thought she didn't belong there? She reached for her usual faded sweater, comfort wrapped in cotton. Then she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror, eyes filled with fear. Yes, but also with memory. Of the storm, the healing, the tape, the garden, the ribbons, the song. She thought of Sophie, of the little girl who had once been hungry not just for food but for love. And she whispered to herself, "You can do this." When she walked out of her room the next evening, dressed in midnight blue, Matthew let out a low whistle. "You look like you're about to own the world." Sophie's eyes shimmered. "You look like her, the woman I always saw, even when you didn't." Elena took a deep breath and smiled. The hotel ballroom sparkled with chandeliers that cast golden light onto rows of white linen tables, each adorned with fresh roses and crystal glasses that chimed gently as guests arrived. Elena stood near the entrance, hand clutched tightly around her evening clutch, breath shallow. Sophie reached for her hand. "You okay?" Elena nodded, but her voice was small. "I've never been in a room like this." Matthew offered a reassuring smile. "Then let the room be lucky to have you in it." They walked together to their assigned table, table 6, close to the stage. Elena's name was printed in graceful script on a small silver placecard. Elena Moore, honoree. She stared at it as if it were someone else's identity. People came by to introduce themselves. Some mentioned the song. A few shared their own stories, daughters estranged from mothers, women finding their voices after years of silence. Every time someone said, "Your words saved me," Elena felt something inside her soften and strengthen. When the event began, a host took the stage and welcomed everyone with practiced grace. "Tonight," he said, "we honor women who have taken heartbreak and turned it into something beautiful. Stories that heal, words that bridge generations, and songs, like the one written by a mother who never thought her voice mattered." Sophie reached for her mother's hand under the table. Elena gripped it tightly. Then the host spoke her name. "Please welcome to the stage Elena Moore." Applause rose around her like a wave. Elena stood, trembling slightly, but she held her head high. Each step to the podium felt heavier than the last, yet somehow truer. She wasn't walking in shame or fear. She was walking in truth. She adjusted the mic. Then she spoke. I didn't think I deserved this. I wasn't a perfect mother. I let pain speak louder than love for too long. But this year, my daughter showed me how to listen. And I found my voice again, beneath the silence, beneath the regret, beneath the fear. I wrote a lullaby once, not knowing anyone would ever hear it. But the thing about songs is, once you let them out, they find the people who need them most. If you're a mother who's made mistakes, I see you. If you're a daughter still waiting for your mother's love, I hear you. And if you're healing, even quietly, I honor you. Silence held the room for a heartbeat. Then the applause came, not polite, but real. People stood. Some wept. Sophie's tears streamed freely. Matthew stood with his arms crossed and pride in his eyes. And Elena, standing at a microphone under soft golden light, felt for the first time in her life, whole. The gala ended with music, laughter, and the low hum of 100 heartfelt conversations. Back in the hotel room, Elena sat on the windowsill, barefoot in her midnight blue gown, looking down at the glowing city below. Sophie walked in after, brushing her teeth, still wrapped in a hotel robe, her eyes heavy with a good kind of exhaustion. Elena didn't speak at first. She was holding something, an old worn photo from her wallet. Sophie stepped closer and saw it was of Elena as a young woman, maybe 19, sitting on the hood of a dusty car, looking skyward with a dreamy, open expression. I forgot this girl existed, Elena said quietly. Sophie sat beside her. She's still there. Elena smiled a little. Tonight made me remember, not just who I was before I became a mother, but why I stayed when I was breaking inside. Sophie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. You stayed because you loved us. No, Elena whispered. I stayed because even when I didn't know how to love myself, you and your brother were the proof that something good came from me. A silence stretched between them, gentle, deep, not needing to be filled. Then Sophie asked, Do you regret it? Elena turned to her. Regret is tricky. I regret the years I lost to anger, the days I didn't know how to show you I cared. But I don't regret being your mother. I never could. A tear slid down Sophie's cheek, and this time, she didn't hide it. I used to wish for a different kind of mother, one who baked cookies and wore aprons and never yelled. I wished to be her, Elena admitted. Sophie smiled. But now I wouldn't trade you for anything. You're the story I needed. Elena reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it. And you're the reason I kept writing, even when I didn't know I was writing at all. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled like quiet stars. In the hush of midnight, Elena did something she hadn't done since Sophie was little. She sang, voice low and warm. Sleep now, my girl. In the cradle of night, I'm here in the bar. Silence holding you tight. Through thunder and sorrow, we've both made it through, and there's nothing more powerful than me loving you. Sophie closed her eyes. And in that moment, between old pain and new beginnings, something unspoken passed between them. A forgiveness too deep for words. Back home, days passed like gentle waves, no longer turbulent, no longer silent, but peaceful. One afternoon, Sophie was cleaning the attic. Dust floated like tiny ghosts in the shafts of light. She was sorting through old boxes looking for forgotten things to donate when she found a small wooden chest. Its brass latch was rusted shut, but she pried it open carefully. Inside, she found faded notebooks, crumpled receipts, a locket with no photo inside, and at the very bottom, a yellowed envelope addressed in neat handwriting. To Sophie Moore, from Mom, but not yet ready. Sophie's breath caught. She sat on a wooden beam, legs crossed, and slowly opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 8 years ago. My dearest Sophie, If you're reading this, I was brave enough to let you. Right now, you're probably angry at me, maybe hurt, maybe both. I can't fix what I didn't know how to do. But I can tell you what I should have said every day. I love you, I always have. Even when I was distant, even when I said the wrong thing. You are not hard to love. I was just too broken to show it. There were nights I sat by your door listening to you cry, my hand on the knob. But I didn't know how to enter your world without making it worse. You were always light to me. But light hurts eyes that have lived too long in the dark. One day I hope I'm brave enough to hand this to you. But if I never do, maybe you'll find it and understand. I was never silent because I didn't care. I was silent because I was scared of how much I did. Love, Mom. Sophie stared at the letter for a long time, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. So much of her childhood had been shaped by not knowing if she was loved, not knowing if she mattered. But now she held the truth in her hands. She brought the letter downstairs. Elena was in the kitchen, humming to herself while kneading dough. She looked up when Sophie entered, eyes softening at the sight of her daughter's expression. I found something, Sophie said. Elena wiped her hands and walked over, brow furrowing as Sophie handed her the letter. You found it, she said quietly. I didn't mean for you to read it like that. I'm glad I did, Sophie replied. I needed it then, but maybe I needed it more now. Elena's lips trembled. I wanted to give it to you so many times, but I thought it would just reopen the wound. It didn't, Sophie said. It helped close it. And for the second time that year, they held each other. Not just as mother and daughter, but as women who survived each other. Together, they folded the letter and placed it inside a frame, a reminder that even unspoken love can still find its voice if given enough time. Sophie's 25th birthday came quietly that year. She hadn't asked for a party. No grand gestures, no glittering decorations, just a quiet dinner at home with her mother and Matthew. Maybe a slice of her favorite vanilla cake with strawberry frosting. But for Elena, it was a milestone that weighed heavy on her heart. Because 25 years ago, she hadn't felt joy when Sophie was born, only fear. She had been alone in a delivery room surrounded by nurses but consumed by a hollow ache in her chest. And for years after that day, Sophie's birthdays reminded her not of love, but of how unprepared she'd felt to mother a child she adored but didn't know how to protect. So this birthday, Elena wanted to do more than bake a cake. She wanted to rewrite the memory. That evening, Sophie returned home from work to find the house filled with a warm, golden glow. Soft music played from the living room, and the scent of vanilla hung in the air. Mom, she called, setting her bag down. In here, Elena answered from the dining room. Sophie turned the corner and stopped short. There was no crowd, no balloons, just a table set for three. Elegant, thoughtful. A single ribbon curled down the center. In Sophie's place was a card with watercolor flowers and a small velvet box. Elena stood beside it, a nervous smile on her lips. Happy birthday, my love. Sophie walked in slowly. You didn't have to. I wanted to, Elena said. This birthday, it's as much yours as it is mine. She gestured to the card. Read that first. Sophie opened it. Inside was Elena's handwriting. 25 years ago, you changed everything. I was scared, but you were not. You came into the world with a cry so fierce it reminded me that I was still alive. Every year since, you've taught me how to be brave, how to be soft, how to forgive, and how to come home to myself. You are the best thing I ever did. Love. Mom. Sophie pressed the card to her chest, fighting back tears. Then Elena handed her the velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet. On its charm was an engraving. Her light changed mine. I never gave you much when you were a little girl, Elena said. But this is something I want you to have now. Not for who you were, but for who you've become. Sophie threw her arms around her mother, holding her tightly. You've given me everything, Mom, she whispered. Matthew walked in just then, holding a candlelit cake. Okay, I think I timed this perfectly. Crying? Check. Hugging? Check. Room needs cake? Triple check. They laughed, and when Sophie blew out the candles, she didn't wish for healing anymore. She had it. It was a rainy Sunday when the doorbell rang. Sophie was curled on the couch with a blanket and a book. Elena was in the kitchen, humming as she stirred soup. The chime startled them both. No one said they were coming, Sophie said. Elena wiped her hands and walked to the door. She opened it and froze. Standing there, soaked from head to toe, was Caroline, Elena's estranged sister. The two women hadn't spoken in nearly 2 decades. Not since the fight, the one that shattered their relationship, splintering their bond into years of silence and stubborn pride. Caroline looked older, of course. Lines marked her face, and her once fiery hair had grayed at the temples. But her eyes, they still burned with the same fierce intensity Elena remembered. "Elena," she said, breathless, "can I come in?" For a moment, Elena said nothing. Then Sophie appeared behind her. "Who is—" Caroline's eyes met hers, and in a tone soft but filled with something unspoken, she said, "You've grown." Elena slowly opened the door, wider. "Come in, you're soaked." Caroline stepped inside hesitantly, dripping water onto the entryway rug. Sophie brought her a towel, eyeing her warily. Elena guided her into the kitchen. "Sit, let me make you tea." Caroline gave a tired laugh. Still with the tea, some things don't change. Elena handed her a steaming cup. Then she finally sat down across from her eyes guarded, but no longer angry. "Why now?" Elena asked quietly. Caroline looked at her, eyes glistening. "Because Mom's gone." The silence landed like a stone. Sophie's eyes widened. "Grandma passed?" Elena nodded slowly, her face unreadable. "When?" "Last week," Caroline whispered. I didn't know how to call you, after everything. But when I found the old photo of the 3 of us, I thought, maybe it's not too late." Sophie stood, torn between confusion and curiosity. "What happened between you two?" Neither woman answered at first. Then Caroline said, "Pain, pride. We buried our parents differently. Elena stayed behind. I left. And we blamed each other for how everything fell apart." Elena looked into her tea. "We stopped being sisters. We became shadows." A pause. And then Caroline reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "She wanted you to have this. Said she should have given it to you when you were 16, but things were already falling apart." Elena opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a delicate gold locket, her mother's. Inside the locket, a faded photo. Elena and Caroline as little girls, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning wildly into the camera. Elena's breath hitched. "Mom kept this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Caroline nodded. "She never stopped loving you. She just didn't know how to say it." Elena stared at the locket for a long time, then looked up at her sister. "Neither did I." Then, slowly, she reached across the table. Caroline took her hand. And just like that, a door that had been closed for 20 years cracked open. It was the first time in over 20 years that Elena, Caroline, and Sophie sat at the same table. The kitchen was warm, filled with the soft bubbling of soup and the rich smell of rosemary bread in the oven. Outside, rain drizzled against the windows, wrapping the house in a hush. Sophie sat in the middle, looking from her mother to her aunt. 2 women shaped by pain, pride, and long-separated paths now circling back toward one another. "So," Sophie said, trying to lighten the air, "tell me something wild about Mom when she was my age." Caroline smirked. "Oh, she was a nightmare." Elena gasped, mock-offended. "Excuse me?" Caroline grinned. "Always writing in journals, always sneaking out to that big oak tree with her guitar. Once she cut school for 3 days because she said she needed artistic space." Sophie burst out laughing. "You rebel," Elena chuckled, shaking her head. I was lost. Music gave me a map. There was something healing in the way they talked, no longer bracing for sharp words, but allowing the past to be softened by memory and distance. Caroline's voice grew quieter. I used to stand outside your room listening to you play. I never told you, but your music always calmed me. It reminded me there was still beauty in our house, even when everything else was breaking. Elena looked at her sister, a lump rising in her throat. Why didn't you say something back then? Because I didn't know how to say I missed you. I was angry. You were angry. And then years just passed. Sophie looked at both of them. Isn't that what happened to you and Grandma too? Elena nodded. Yes. And I don't want it to happen to you and me. Sophie reached across the table, taking both women's hands. It won't. We've already broken that pattern. Caroline smiled at her niece. You're like glue, you know that? Holding pieces together. Sophie shrugged. Maybe I just refuse to accept that love should stay broken. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elena stood and walked over to the piano in the corner of the living room. It hadn't been played in months. She sat down, fingers brushing the keys. She played a melody, simple, gentle, familiar, the lullaby she once sang to Sophie. Caroline moved beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Sophie joined them, voice quiet but sure, singing the lyrics they all now knew. Sleep now, my girl, in the cradle of night. I'm here in the silence, holding you tight. And as the last note hung in the air, three women, mother, daughter, sister, shared something fragile and fierce. Hope, not for a perfect future, but for a healed one. A week after Caroline's visit, Elena opened the door to her old childhood bedroom. It had been untouched since the day she left home at 17, an emotional hurricane behind her. Dust clung to the windowsills. A faded poster of Joni Mitchell still hung above the desk. The smell was musty, like old paper and forgotten things. Sophie followed her in. This was your room? Elena nodded slowly. Where I wrote my first songs, where I cried into a pillow so no one could hear, where I promised myself I'd never turn out like her. Sophie ran her fingers over the edge of the desk. And yet, here we are. I was angry, Elena said, at everything. Mom, Dad, life. I didn't understand yet that sometimes people give what they were taught, even if it's not enough. Sophie sat on the bed. It creaked under her. Did she ever come in here after you left? Caroline had told them recently that their mother rarely entered this room, said it felt like a museum of her failure. Elena walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a notebook. Inside were lyrics, old ones, and in the margins, barely visible, were comments written in her mother's handwriting. Beautiful line. This stanza feels like truth. You're finding your voice. Elena blinked. She read these. Sophie looked up. She never told you? No, but she underlined things, left notes, quiet ones. She loved you, Mom, even if she didn't say it out loud. Elena sat beside her, notebook in hand, overwhelmed by a realization. Her mother had been trying, in her quiet way, with pens instead of hugs, with silent presence instead of loud affection. Not enough, maybe, but not nothing, and sometimes even a whisper is a lifeline. They spent the afternoon cleaning the room, dusting off the memories, packing up the relics of a girl who had once vowed to run and never look back, but who had somehow found her way, full circle. Before leaving, Elena left something on the desk, a copy of the letter her mother never mailed, and beneath it a single line written freshly in Elena's hand. I read your notes. I see you now. The moonlight streamed through Sophie's window, casting pale lines across the wall. She tossed and turned, unable to settle. Her mind raced, not with stress or fear, but with something else, something she couldn't name. It was like a pulse, inside her chest, quietly knocking. She finally gave up on sleep. Padding downstairs barefoot, she found the house silent. Elena was already in bed. The only sound was the distant ticking of the hallway clock, marking time too loudly. Sophie went to the living room and sat at the piano. She hadn't touched it since the lullaby night. She opened the lid, her fingers hovering over the keys. Then gently she began to play. Not a song she knew, but one she felt. It started slow, uncertain, then grew, flowing into something aching and hopeful. A blend of every emotion she'd swallowed over the last year. Heartbreak, forgiveness, confusion, peace. As the final note hung in the air, a voice broke the silence. "That's yours, isn't it?" Sophie turned. Elena stood in the doorway, her robe wrapped tight around her, eyes soft. "I didn't mean to wake you," Sophie whispered. "You didn't," Elena said, walking in slowly. "I heard the music, I always hear you." Sophie smiled faintly. "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To write my song." They sat side by side on the piano bench. Sophie reached for a notebook and began scribbling lyrics. Elena didn't hover or guide. She just sat, watching her daughter create. It felt full circle. Once Elena had written music to survive. Now Sophie was writing to understand, to grow. "Do you want help?" Elena finally asked. Sophie paused, pen in the air, then shook her head. "No, but I'd love for you to hear it when I'm done." Elena smiled, brushing a lock of hair from Sophie's face. "That's all I ever wanted, to be invited in." And so, in the quiet of that moonlit night, Sophie wrote. Not a song of pain, but a song of becoming. A song about mothers and daughters and the fragile threads between them. Broken, mended, golden with time. It began with a soft knock on the ceiling, then another. Sophie looked up. "What's in the attic?" Elena, sipping tea by the window, glanced over. "Just old boxes, photos, maybe a few regrets." Sophie smirked. "That sounds like a challenge." Sophie climbed the ladder with a flashlight in hand. The attic smelled of cedar and secrets. Dust swirled in the beam of light. Cardboard boxes were stacked like forgotten tombstones of memory. She pulled one down. Inside, photographs, dozens, black and white faded colors, curled edges. Then she found one that made her breath catch. It was Elena, around Sophie's age, eyes fierce, holding a guitar, standing beside a woman with tightly pursed lips and arms crossed. Her grandmother, frozen defiance and disappointment in one frame. Sophie brought the photo downstairs. Elena took one look and sat down, stunned. "I forgot this even existed," she whispered. "She looked cold," Sophie said gently. "She was, but sometimes she tried." This was after my first recital. She told me the dress was too short but drove me anyway. Stayed in the back row, never clapped, but she came. "She showed up in her way," Sophie said. Elena nodded. "Sometimes love isn't loud. It's just there." That night, Sophie returned to the attic. She wasn't searching anymore, she was listening. To the creak of the floorboards, to the echo of forgotten footsteps, to the stories that had never been told, but lived in every dust-covered box. Sophie found it the next morning, tucked under, a stack of poetry books in one of the attic boxes, a small dusty cassette tape recorder. It was heavy in her hands, scratched with age but still intact. Taped to the back was a sticky note in faded ink, for when you're ready to hear her voice again. "Caroline." She carried it downstairs with trembling hands. Elena was washing dishes when she entered. "Mom," Sophie said softly. "I found something." Elena dried her hands and turned, eyes narrowing when she saw the recorder. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "In a box labeled, 'To Elena. Don't open until you're brave.'" Elena's breath hitched. She used to record her thoughts, when she didn't know how to say things out loud. Sophie pressed play, a moment of static, Then her grandmother's voice filled the room. Older, slower, but unmistakably her. "Elena, I know I failed you in ways you'll carry for a long time. I didn't know how to be soft. I was raised in silence and steel. But I want you to know, I watched you grow into someone fierce and beautiful. I just never knew how to say it. If you're hearing this, I hope you've forgiven me by now. Or at least, tried. You deserved better. I loved you. I just didn't know how to show it without breaking." Elena's hand covered her mouth. Sophie sat beside her, placing a hand over her mother's heart. They listened until the tape clicked off. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes love arrives years too late, but still in time to heal. Later, that afternoon, Sophie returned to the attic, not to explore but to gather. She collected every letter, every notebook, every scrap of handwriting she could find that belonged to her grandmother. Then she spread them out on the living room floor like a mosaic of a woman who'd only recently become more than a shadow. Elena joined her silently, lowering herself to the floor, stunned by the sheer number of pages. "These are all hers?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie nodded. "I think she wanted you to find them. Eventually." They read for hours. Some letters were unfinished. Others had tear stains. Some were addressed to Elena. Others were simply dated and signed with initials. One in particular made Elena stop breathing. "Elena, I saw you in that red dress at your senior concert. You played like the whole world was listening. I wanted to run up and tell you I was proud. I didn't. I froze. I always froze when it mattered. But I want you to know, when you played that last note, I cried. Not because you were brilliant, but because you were brave." Elena closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I never knew she felt that," she whispered. "She was there, and I thought she left before I finished." Sophie gently took her mother's hand. "Maybe she stayed longer than you thought, in more ways than one." By evening, the letters were carefully placed into a new box. One not labeled in fear or regret, but in healing. Her words. Elena took a pen and added a second label underneath. "Finally read." That evening after dinner, Elena and Sophie stepped out onto the front porch. The sky was painted in hues of lavender and gold, the kind of dusk that made the world feel suspended between what was and what could still be. Neither spoke at first. They sat on the old wooden swing, its chains creaking gently with every sway. Sophie rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "I used to dream of leaving this house and never looking back," Elena said quietly. "But lately I've been thinking about what it would mean to stay." Sophie looked up. "You mean move back here?" "Not forever, but maybe long enough to finish something I never did." She glanced toward the attic window. "There's still music in this house, and maybe a little of me left to write." Sophie smiled. "You think Grandma would have liked that?" Elena nodded slowly. "I think she would have finally said yes, maybe even clapped." A breeze rustled the leaves. Crickets began their chorus. Sophie pulled a folded page from her pocket, the song she'd been working on since that sleepless night. "I want you to hear something," she said. She handed it over. Elena read the first lines, her voice catching. "She loved in echoes, not in thunder. She stitched silence into lullabies. And now I sing because she never did. A voice that's hers, made mine." Elena looked up, her eyes brimming. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Sophie smiled. "It's only the first verse." The swing rocked gently beneath them as the sky darkened into stars. Mother and daughter, sitting together, not as wounds and regrets, but as women learning to love out loud. 2 weeks later, Sophie stood backstage at a small cafe downtown, the kind that smelled of espresso, wood polish, and nerves. It was open mic night. Her name was third on the list. Elena stood beside her, guitar case in hand, her expression a mix of pride and fear. "You sure about this?" Elena asked. Sophie nodded. Are you? Elena gave a nervous laugh. First time I've been on stage in years. Then let's make it count. They weren't performing together, not yet, but they had each other's backs. The host called Sophie's name. Applause rippled as she stepped into the spotlight. Guitar slung across her chest. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the mic. She looked out at the small crowd and saw her mother, front row, arms crossed, eyes shining. Sophie strummed the first chord, and then she sang. She taught me to speak. In silence, and I turned it into sound. A girl becomes her mother's echo, but mine was never loud. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was real. By the end of the song, the room was still, listening. When she finished, there was a beat of silence, then clapping, warm and full. Elena stood. She was the first to applaud. And for the first time, Sophie saw her mother not as a woman burdened by the past, but as one reshaped by love. After Sophie's performance, there was a break for coffee and conversation, but Sophie noticed Elena had grown unusually quiet. Are you okay? She asked. Elena was staring at the stage, fingers tightening around the handle of her guitar case. I think I need to do something, she said, before I talk myself out of it. When the host returned to the mic and asked for the next performer, Elena stood. Sophie's eyes widened. Mom? Elena just smiled and stepped forward. The crowd, unaware of the history or emotion behind this moment, offered polite applause. But Sophie knew this was more than a performance. This was a reclaiming. Elena sat on the stool, guitar in her lap. She took a slow breath and began to play. Her voice was husky with age and memory, but strong. The song wasn't new. It was one Sophie recognized from a distant childhood, a tune Elena used to hum while doing dishes before she ever spoke of her past. I buried dreams to keep you fed, I hid my voice behind your bed, but silence doesn't mean surrender, just waiting for a softer end. Sophie felt tears welling up. This wasn't just her mother's voice. It was her mother choosing to speak. The room fell still. No coffee clinks, no whispers. Only the music. When the final chord faded, there was a silence that felt reverent. Then, applause. Longer this time. Earnest. Elena looked down, smiling through tears. She found Sophie's face in the crowd. And for the first time, Sophie didn't see her mother as someone broken by choices, but someone rebuilt by bravery. The cafe had emptied out slowly, the last claps echoing long after the lights dimmed. Sophie and Elena stayed behind, sitting together in the quiet, still holding their guitars, as if putting them down might break the spell of the evening. You were incredible, Sophie whispered. Elena gave a shy smile. I forgot how it feels to be heard. They looked at each other, mother and daughter, musician and musician, no longer split by silence but woven together by sound. Then, the cafe owner approached. She was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. I don't usually say this, she said, looking at Elena. But your song, it stayed in the room after you left the stage. Elena blinked, unsure how to respond. The woman turned to Sophie. And yours felt like an echo of hers? You two ever thought of playing together? Sophie glanced at her mom. Elena hesitated for a moment, then laughed, soft and full. We're just learning how to do that. But maybe, someday. The woman nodded. Well, if you ever do, come back here. This place remembers good music. As the woman walked away, Sophie whispered, Do you think we could perform together? Elena looked thoughtful. I think, for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid to try. And in that quiet cafe where their voices had finally found a home, 2 generations of women began to imagine what healing could sound like, together. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of the old house. Sophie and Elena sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea, surrounded by the quiet calm that follows something brave. There were no more secrets in the attic, no more fear in their voices. But there was something new. Space. The kind of space that only exists. When wounds start to heal, I was thinking, Elena said, stirring her tea. What if we stay a little longer, just take our time here? Sophie looked up. You mean not go back right away? Elena nodded. There's still music in these walls, and stories to finish, and maybe new ones to write. Sophie smiled. I like that. She reached for the notebook that now followed her everywhere. The one filled with lyrics, letters, and lines of dialogue that weren't just hers but theirs. You know, she said, flipping to a fresh page, this could be the beginning of a second act. Elena raised her mug in a toast. To the second act, they clinked their mugs together, mother and daughter no longer just surviving but living. Outside, birds sang. Inside, the kettle whistled again, and somewhere between silence and song they had finally found home. Elena wandered into the attic again, not to search, but to listen. Dust hung lazily in the air, and the soft creak of the wooden floor welcomed her like an old friend. She moved slowly, running her fingers along the spines of forgotten books and the fabric of a worn-out chair where her mother used to sit. In the corner, under a faded quilt, was an old leather-bound songbook, one Elena hadn't seen before. Her mother's initials were carved faintly on the front. ML. She opened it gently. Inside were pages of unfinished compositions. Some were no more than a few lines. Others included full lyrics, sketched in cursive with notations in the margins, like her mother had been trying to teach herself how to say what she never dared to speak aloud. One song in particular caught her breath. She watches from windows, never from doors. She lives in the silence, behind quiet chores. She hums to the moon when no one can see, hoping her daughter becomes what she couldn't be. Elena sat down, holding the book close to her chest. Her mother had never played this song for anyone. It wasn't polished. It wasn't even finished. But it was honest. Later that night, she brought the book down to Sophie. I found something, Elena said. Sophie read the lyrics slowly, her expression softening with each word. It's beautiful, Elena nodded. I want us to finish it, together. And just like that, a song that had waited in silence for years began to breathe again, this time through the hands of two women, bound by blood, memory, and music. The living room transformed into a makeshift studio, chords scribbled across post-its, coffee mugs balanced on stacks of music sheets, a laptop open with recording software blinking, waiting to capture something fragile. Elena sat cross-legged on the rug, the old leather-bound songbook open in front of her. Sophie paced slowly, plucking soft melodies on her guitar. They had never written together before, not like this, not with the weight of someone else's voice woven between their own. This line, Sophie said, pointing to a faded lyric, I think Grandma meant it for you. Elena read the words again. She walks alone in rooms she once filled with light. A beat passed. Elena looked up, her eyes distant. She did. She never said it, but I think she regretted not walking with me. Sophie nodded and strummed. A few notes. Then maybe the next line should be ours, she said softly. Something about not repeating the silence. Elena picked up a pen. Her fingers trembled for just a second, but then moved with purpose. But her daughter lit candles where the dark used to be. They stared at it, and then, without a word, Sophie began to play. Elena sang the next line, unsure at first. But Sophie joined in, harmony weaving into the melody like threads pulled from the past and spun into the present. For the first time, the three generations, mother, daughter, and the woman who came before them, existed in the same song. Finished. Together, a lullaby for what was lost, a chorus for what had been found, and a promise never to let silence win again. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when they decided to record it. Sophie had cleared a corner of the living room. A blanket hung over the window to soften the light, and pillows stacked on chairs helped deaden the echo. A microphone stood between them, borrowed from a friend at school who wanted to help record something real. Elena sat with her guitar, the finished lyrics lying nearby. Sophie adjusted the mic level, heart pounding with excitement and nerves. "You ready?" she asked. Elena exhaled. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The room hushed. Sophie hit record. The first strum of the guitar was hesitant, but familiar. Then Elena began to sing, her voice full of something that couldn't be trained. Memory, pain, love. Sophie joined in on the second verse, her voice lighter, younger, but steady. Together they told a story in song of a woman who couldn't speak, her truth until her daughter helped her find the words, of a girl who stopped chasing echoes and began making her own sound. By the time they reached the final chorus, they weren't just singing for her grandmother anymore, they were singing with her. When the last chord faded, they sat in silence, not awkward, just full. Sophie reached forward and stopped the recording. The waveform froze on screen. Curved, beautiful, permanent. Elena wiped her eyes. She would have loved it. She does love it, Sophie said softly. She just never had the words. Elena turned toward her daughter and smiled. But we do. And in the quiet afterward, they listened again, not just to the recording, but to the proof that healing had a sound, and they had captured it. Later that night, the house was still, except for the faint clicking of keys. Sophie sat at her laptop, the final mix of the song echoing softly in her headphones. She had layered their vocals, cleaned up the background noise, and added a subtle piano track beneath the melody. Nothing flashy, just honest. Elena leaned over her shoulder. "You're really uploading it?" Sophie looked up. "Only if you're okay with it." Elena hesitated, eyes lingering on the screen. The title glowed faintly, "For the Women Who Stayed Silent." Her throat tightened. She thought of her mother, of herself, of the years that stretched in silence. But then she looked at Sophie. Eyes, lit with purpose, hands ready to share what they had created. "I'm okay," Elena whispered. "In fact, I think I need this." Sophie nodded. She clicked upload. They watched as the progress bar crept forward. 60%, 80, done. It was out there now, a song born in shadows now cast into the light. They didn't speak for a long time, just sat on the couch side by side, letting the moment settle in. Then Sophie grinned. "What if this actually reaches people?" Elena gave a soft laugh. "Then I hope it finds the ones who need it." Somewhere the world was already listening, and just like that, a story once buried in attic dust began to ripple through speakers, headphones, and hearts, far beyond the walls of their home. By morning the views had trickled in, just a few hundred, but the comments were what stopped them both in their tracks. Sophie scrolled through them with wide eyes, reading each one aloud as Elena stood behind her, arms folded tightly, but heart wide open. "This made me cry. I lost my mom last year. She never told me how she felt. This song felt like her voice. I've never heard something that captured my relationship with my daughter so clearly. Thank you. Who wrote this? I need more. Please tell me this isn't the last." Elena stared at the screen, silent. "You okay?" Sophie asked gently. "I never thought," Elena whispered, "that my pain could give someone else comfort." Sophie turned around. "Because you didn't just share pain. You shared truth. That's what people connect to." Elena sank onto the couch, overwhelmed, her hand pressed to her chest. It wasn't pride she felt. It was release. Each comment, each listener, was proof. The story she'd hidden in shame now lived in others as healing. Sophie's phone buzzed. She opened it and blinked. "Elena," she said slowly. "A woman from a radio station just messaged. She wants to talk about the song." Maybe feature it. Elena looked at her, stunned. A radio station? Sophie smiled. They said it feels like a song for all mothers. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then as the meaning settled in, they both laughed. Exhausted, shocked, alive. Because the song hadn't just gone out into the world. It had, answered someone. And in doing so, it had changed everything. 2 days later, Elena found herself sitting in a small soundproof booth at the local radio station, wearing oversized headphones and trying not to fidget. Sophie sat across from her, notebook in hand, her presence a steady anchor. The host was a warm-voiced woman in her 40s named Clara, who smiled as if she already knew Elena's whole story, even if she didn't. We're live in 3, 2. The red light blinked on. Clara leaned in. Today, we're joined by 2 extraordinary women whose song, For the Women Who Stayed Silent, has taken our listeners by storm. Elena and Sophie, welcome. Elena swallowed hard, cleared her throat. Thank you for having us. Clara nodded. You wrote this song from your mother's old lyrics, Elena? Elena glanced at Sophie, then nodded. Yes. My mother never shared much while she was alive, but she left behind words, pieces of something unfinished. This was our way, Sophie's and mine, of helping her speak, and maybe forgiving her. There was a pause. Clara leaned closer. It's brave, turning grief into something that reaches others. Elena's voice softened. It's the first time I've felt like I wasn't just surviving her memory, but continuing it. With my daughter. Sophie added, music is how we found each other again. A quiet moment passed in the studio. Clara smiled. Well, let's let the song speak for itself. She pressed a button, and through the studio speakers their song played. Elena's voice layered with Sophie's, rich and tender, like history unfolding. For a few minutes the air was full of what couldn't be said in interviews. When it ended, Clara's eyes glistened. That's not just a song, that's a bridge. Elena reached over and took Sophie's hand. They had crossed it, together. Back home, Elena and Sophie sat in stunned silence, their phones buzzing nonstop. The radio appearance had sparked something. Not just attention, but connection. Their inboxes were overflowing with emails, voice notes, and private messages from people they had never met. People who now felt like distant family, drawn together by invisible threads. My mom and I haven't spoken in 3 years. I sent her your song today, she wrote back. Thank you. I played this for my teenage daughter, she cried. Then we sat down and talked. We haven't done that in ages. Your mother would be proud of you both. You've honored her silence by breaking your own. Elena read each message slowly, some with tears blurring the screen. She had spent so long believing her pain was too personal, too messy, too quiet to matter. But now, all over the world, other mothers and daughters were talking again, and that mattered more than she could ever explain. Sophie leaned against her, reading over her shoulder. You started this. No, Elena corrected, wrapping her arm around her daughter. We did. There was a knock on the door, then another surprise. The local women's center had heard the song and wanted Elena and Sophie to speak at an upcoming event about healing generational wounds. Elena stared at the invitation. I'm not a speaker, she murmured. Sophie smiled gently. You weren't a songwriter either, but here we are. Elena laughed softly, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Okay, let's do it. In sharing their song, they had opened a door for others, and now more than ever Elena knew. They weren't just healing the past, they were rewriting the future. The community hall buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly. Mothers holding daughters' hands, grandmothers sitting beside teenagers, some women coming alone but looking around with eyes full of recognition. On the small stage, Elena stood clutching a note card, heart racing. Sophie stood beside her, calm, encouraging, grounding her like a steady hand on her back. The event coordinator introduced them simply. A mother and daughter who turned a buried song into something that speaks to all of us. Elena took the mech. The light above her made her blink, but she didn't flinch. I used to believe silence was strength, she began, voice low but sure. That pain should be hidden. That if something broke you, you patched it quietly and moved on. She looked out at the sea of faces all waiting. But silence didn't make me strong, it made me distant. From my own daughter. From myself. From a mother I never fully knew. She glanced at Sophie, then continued. When we found the song, my mother's unfinished lyrics, we didn't just finish her words. We began our own conversation. We stopped hiding and started listening. The room was utterly still. Sophie stepped forward, voice clear. You don't need to write a song or stand on a stage. You just need to say the first true thing to someone you love or even to yourself. A woman in the front row wiped a tear. Then another raised her hand and said, "Can I share something too?" And just like that, the event became a circle of stories. One by one, voices that had been quiet for years spoke up. Elena listened, not as a performer, not as someone with answers, but as someone who understood what it meant to finally be heard. That night, she and Sophie left the hall with tired eyes and full hearts. The echo of other women's stories followed them out into the night air like music still playing. A week after the event, Elena returned to the attic, not to search, not to escape, but to say goodbye. She stepped carefully across the wooden floorboards, the air no longer heavy with regret. Light filtered in through the cracked window, and for the first time the room felt warm. Elena sat where she had found the songbook, her fingers tracing the spot as if it still carried the hum of her mother's silence. Then beneath an old stack of magazines, something caught her eye. A small envelope, yellowed but sealed. Her name written in careful curling script. Elena. Her hands trembled as she opened it. My dearest girl, if you ever find this, it means you stayed. It means you chose to open the boxes I left behind instead of locking them away forever. I hope by now you know that I was never silent because I didn't care. I was silent because I didn't know how to speak without breaking something. You always had a fire I never dared to follow. I watched it glow from the sidelines, both proud and terrified. If I could rewrite the past, I would have danced more in the kitchen with you, sung more lullabies, apologized more freely. But I'm writing this now to say, if you ever find your way back to your own voice, use it. Loudly, fiercely, without guilt. And if you ever have a daughter, tell her everything I couldn't. With love that never found enough words. Mom Elena. Pressed the letter to her heart and let the tears come. Grateful this time not for closure but for connection. Later that evening, she read the letter aloud to Sophie. And together, they didn't mourn what was lost. They celebrated what had finally been found. The house was quiet that night, not with emptiness but with peace. Elena stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of tea as Sophie curled up nearby, sketching song ideas in her notebook. The radio played softly in the background, their song nestled between a mix of evening jazz and quiet ballads. It had begun to feel normal, and yet nothing about this was ordinary. Elena pulled the letter from her sweater pocket once more. She hadn't let it out of her sight since she found it. Every time she read it, new words seemed to rise to the surface, like her mother was still speaking to her, sentence by sentence. She sat down across from Sophie. You know what I realized? Sophie looked up. What? I spent my whole life trying not to become my mother. But now, I think I'm finally understanding her, and in a way, maybe I've made peace with becoming part of her. Sophie smiled gently. You became the part of her that wanted to be heard. The words settled between them like a soft breeze. Then Elena stood up and walked over to the record shelf. She pulled out a vinyl, one of her mother's favorites. A jazz ballad from the 1960s, full of aching harmonies and smoky piano. She placed it on the player, let the needle drop, and extended a hand to her daughter. Dance with me? Sophie laughed, but took it. You really are becoming sentimental. Maybe, Elena said, twirling her slowly. Or maybe I'm just finally living. They danced barefoot and easy, surrounded by the quiet echo of healing. And in that moment, it wasn't just Elena and Sophie in the kitchen. There were 3 generations of women moving together, one who had been silent, one who had listened, and one who had learned how to speak. A crisp envelope arrived in the mail a few days later. No return address, just embossed lettering. Wild Stream Studios. Sophie opened it first, her eyebrows arching as she read aloud. They want to meet us in person. They heard the song, and they're interested in a full album. Elena blinked. Wait, what? Sophie handed her the letter, laughing. This is real, Mom. They want us to come in, sit with their producers, see if we're serious about making more music together. Elena read the message twice, then a third time. It wasn't just kind words or online praise anymore. This was a door, one she'd never imagined standing in front of, let alone being invited through. I'm not a musician, she murmured. Sophie stepped closer. You're a storyteller, a survivor. You write what matters. That's what music needs. Elena shook her head, overwhelmed, but Sophie wasn't backing down. You are the music now, and it doesn't matter if you've never been in a studio. I have. I can guide you. A quiet pause passed between them. Then Elena whispered, What, if I mess it up? Sophie grinned. Then we fix it together, just like the song. Elena finally smiled, soft and brave. Okay, let's go. That night they packed a small bag. Just notebooks, a voice recorder, and the letter from Elena's mother, which Elena tucked into her case like a talisman. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in years, the unknown didn't feel threatening. It felt like a beginning. Wild Stream Studios sat tucked between tall glass buildings, its entrance understated, just a matte black door with a single brass knocker. Elena hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. It was all polished, wood and quiet humming from unseen speakers. A young assistant greeted them and led them down a hall that smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. They entered a room with warm lighting, instruments hung on the walls, and a grand piano in the corner. Behind the glass window of the recording booth, a producer sat adjusting knobs, waving as they walked in. You must be Sophie and Elena, he said, standing to shake their hands. I'm Levi, been playing that song on repeat all week. You've got something raw, honest. We don't get that much anymore. Elena flushed, unsure how to respond. Sophie took the lead. We're honored. We never expected it to go this far. Levi gestured to 2 chairs near the mic. Let's not talk about what you expected. Let's talk about what you want to say next. He handed Elena a pair of headphones. Try something, anything. Just hum if you want. Speak. We just want to hear you. Elena sat down, heart pounding, and glanced at Sophie, who nodded with gentle encouragement. She closed her eyes, and then, from somewhere deep inside her, a melody slipped out. Quiet at first, trembling, but unmistakably hers. She didn't try to impress. She didn't try to sound polished. She just remembered. Words her mother used to say. The sound of rain on the roof, the ache of watching Sophie sleep during those years when love felt distant. And from that came something that wasn't just a melody. It was memory, grief, joy, and survival, all in one voice. When she stopped, the room was silent. Levi looked at her, stunned. You're not a songwriter? He said, half laughing. Could have fooled me. Elena exhaled, blinking back tears. I guess I'm learning. Sophie leaned over and whispered, You're doing more than learning. You're becoming. They returned to the studio for the next 3 days. Levi cleared his schedule. He said it was rare to hear someone like Elena, someone who didn't sing for attention, but because silence had become too heavy to carry. Her voice was textured, imperfect and human. People wouldn't just listen, they'd feel her. Elena sat at the piano one morning, eyes closed, remembering the melody from her mother's old lullaby. She let her fingers find the chords gently, shaping something new, her own variation, soft but determined. Sophie sat in the corner, scribbling lyrics as Elena played. "You're not just healing," Sophie said once. "You're creating something no one else can. A new story from an old ache." Elena smiled. "I spent so long afraid of my voice. Now I'm afraid to lose it." "You won't," Sophie said. "It's yours now. Forever." Between takes, Elena read from her journal. Fragments turned into lyrics. Half whispers turned into verses. Sometimes she'd speak a memory, and Levi would nod and build music around it like scaffolding. One morning, Levi played back a rough mix of a new track they had created together. Elena listened as her voice came through the speakers, not broken or strained, but whole, resonant, like a woman reclaiming her name in every note. She turned to Sophie. "You really think this is worth hearing?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "I think it's exactly what the world needs to hear." And for the first time, Elena believed her. The voice she had spent years burying had become her legacy, not a whisper, lost in time, but a sound that stretched forward. She wasn't just echoing her mother's silence anymore. She was transforming it into a song that might outlive them both. The next track came easily. Too easily, Elena thought. It flowed like water. It was titled simply, Margaret, her mother's name. She hadn't said it aloud in years, not since the funeral, not in conversations, not in prayers. She had buried that name like it was a wound too deep to touch. But now she sang it. Not just once, but again and again. At first it was tender, then stronger, braided with the echo of years they never got to speak. She sang of Margaret's quiet, Margaret's kindness, Margaret's mistakes and her longing, her broken lullabies, her unfinished letters. Levi stopped the track halfway through the first take and said, voice thick, that one's going on the album. No edits. Elena turned to Sophie, breathless. It hurts. Sophie squeezed her hand. Because it's real. But you didn't just write about her. You gave her a voice. They listened to it that night in the car on the drive home from the studio. Streetlights flickered across the windshield. Sophie was quiet beside her, staring ahead. Elena rested her hand on the wheel but let the song fill the silence, and when her own voice sang Margaret through the speakers, she felt something shift inside. Not grief, not quite forgiveness, but presence. Her mother was here, not in a ghostly sense, but in the beat of the song, in the vibration of the air, in the fact that her name was no longer lost, it was sung, and that made all the difference. The small venue was packed. It wasn't a stadium, or even a grand hall, just an intimate local theater with velvet chairs, warm lights, and a crowd of about 100 people. But for Elena, it might as well have been the moon. She stood backstage, heart racing, staring at the microphone, waiting under the spotlight. Sophie was already tuning her guitar, calm, confident, sending her a quiet smile that said, "We've got this." "I don't think I can go out there," Elena whispered. "Yes, you can," Sophie replied gently, "because you're not performing. You're sharing just like you've always done with me, with the studio, with yourself." A voice called out, "You're on in too." Elena took a breath that felt like it stretched across every year she had spent silent. And then she stepped out. The applause was soft but welcoming, like 100 people saying, "We're listening." She sat beside Sophie. No fancy introduction. No grand entrance, just a mother and daughter with a story stitched into melody. The first song was Margaret. The crowd quieted as soon as Elena sang the name. You could feel it ripple, people recognizing a mother they'd lost, or never, knew or still loved from afar. When she finished, no one clapped right away. Someone in the front row wiped their eyes, someone in the back whispered, "That was my mom's name too." And then the applause came, full, heartfelt, rising like a wave. Elena didn't need a chart topper. She didn't. Need a contract. This was it. Her voice had reached people. Not with perfection, but with truth. And in that quiet theater, she finally felt something she hadn't known she was waiting for. Not praise, but freedom. 2 days after the performance, the letters began arriving. Not emails, not texts, handwritten letters. Folded pages with messy cursive, ink-smudged corners, and hearts drawn in the margins. Some addressed only to Elena, the woman who sang Margaret. They came from women in retirement homes, from college students, from single fathers who had never dared speak about grief out loud. Your song reminded me of my mother's garden. I hadn't thought of it in years. Thank you for bringing it back. I lost my daughter 2 years ago. You helped me remember her without pain. You made me cry in a way that felt safe. Elena read each one slowly, sometimes more than once. She kept them in a wooden box on her writing desk, beside her mother's letter. Each one, a thread connecting her to people she'd never met, yet somehow knew. She realized something important then. Her mother's silence had once felt like abandonment. But now, Elena understood. It had also been fear. Fear of hurting the ones she loved. Fear of being too much or not enough. And in breaking her own silence, Elena had offered something Margaret never could. A voice, not just for herself, but for others. Sophie came in one afternoon and found her sorting the letters. "You've started a conversation," she said. "People are listening because you dared to speak." Elena looked up with soft eyes. "I think I'm finally ready to write the next song," Sophie grinned. "What about?" Elena smiled. "About what happens after the silence ends." Elena sat alone in the studio for the first time. Levi had offered to stay, but she declined. She needed the room to be hers, the quiet, the echoes, the smell of pine from the guitar rack in the corner. Sophie was in the booth watching through the glass. She didn't need to play today. She just needed to be there. Elena stared at the blank page in her journal. No lyrics yet. No melody. But there was a rhythm, not from the instruments, from her breath. She began writing a song, one without a chorus. No repetition, no anchor. Just verses that changed like seasons, flowing forward with every stanza. It told the story of a woman who raised her daughter in silence. Then the daughter who grew up afraid to speak. Then the moment the silence cracked open and songs began to pour through. Verse by verse, Elena traced the outline of her own becoming. She didn't try to rhyme. She didn't try to impress. She just told the truth. And when she sang it, low, steady, without flourish, Sophie pressed the intercom button in the booth and whispered, "That's the one." Elena smiled through tears. "But there's no hook, no chorus." "Exactly," Sophie replied. "It never circles back, just like healing. It keeps going forward." They recorded it once, then twice, then not again. It didn't need polish. It needed space. The title they gave it later was simple, "The Song with No Chorus," and it became the most requested track on the album. A few weeks after the album's digital release, Elena received a message from someone she hadn't heard from in over 2 decades. Claire, her childhood friend, the one she'd drifted away from during the long years of struggle and silence. "I listened to Margaret by accident. Didn't realize it was you until I read the liner notes. I cried. A lot. I miss you. Can we talk?" Elena stared at the message, her heart thudding. It had been years. They had shared everything as girls. Bedtime secrets, first heartbreaks, birthday cakes and bruised knees. Then, somewhere in the maze of motherhood and pain, Elena had pulled away, disconnected from everyone who reminded her of who she used to be. She didn't reply at first, not because she didn't want to, because she didn't know how. But Sophie nudged her gently that evening. She reached out. That takes courage, just like singing did. So Elena wrote back, "I've missed you too. Maybe it's time I stop hiding." "Yes. Let's talk." They met at a quiet cafe near the park where they'd once played as children. Claire looked older, wiser, softer. Her hair had streaks of silver, but her smile hadn't changed. Neither had Elena's nervous laugh. They hugged, long and wordless. Then came the tea, the stories, the cautious laughter as they caught up. Claire had 2 grown sons, a dog, a garden she kept just like her mother had. "I always knew you'd find your voice," Claire said quietly. "Even when you stopped talking to me, I knew it was still in you, waiting." Elena blinked back tears. "I didn't think I deserved friends. Not back then." "You do now," Claire replied, "and you always did." They walked together after that, along the path they used to race down as girls, not speaking much. But the silence between them now felt different, not empty, restored. Elena never thought she'd be sitting across from a journalist again. But this time, the room was small, quiet, and warm. Not the cold glare of lights or cameras, just a podcast studio downtown with soft lighting and the low hum of background equipment. The interviewer, Lillian, was young and respectful, someone who had clearly done her homework. She greeted Elena with a gentle handshake and a smile that said, "I care about your story, not just your success." They sat down. The microphones were adjusted. A red light blinked on. "So, Elena," Lillian began, "your album is raw, beautiful, honest. It's touched so many people. But I want to ask something more personal. What finally gave you permission to tell your truth?" Elena paused. She glanced at Sophie sitting quietly just outside the frame, and then she spoke. "It wasn't about permission," she said. "It was about exhaustion. I was so tired of carrying pain like it was a private shame. I thought silence was strength. But it was just fear. And fear wasn't loving me back." Lillian nodded, eyes wide. "And your daughter? What has this journey meant for your relationship with her?" Elena smiled. "Everything. She held the light when I couldn't see the way. Sophie didn't push me. She waited. And when I was ready, she opened the door." The interview lasted an hour. They talked. About the songs, yes, but also about motherhood, about regret, about starting over when you think it's too late. When it was over, Lillian took off her headphones and leaned across the table. "My mother stopped speaking to me 5 years ago," she whispered. "After listening to your album, I called her." Elena blinked, stunned. "Did she answer?" "She did," Lillian said. "And we talked. For the first time in years." In that moment, Elena understood. The music wasn't just healing her story. It was mending the quiet, aching spaces in others too. Elena sat at the kitchen table, a pot of tea steaming between her and Sophie. Outside, the wind carried the soft, golden dust of early autumn. Leaves skittered across the porch. The house, once filled with the silence of unresolved memories, now felt full, alive. Sophie had been staying more often lately, not because Elena needed her, but because she wanted to. Their relationship had evolved into something stronger than dependence. It had become a friendship between equals, anchored by mutual understanding. "I was thinking," Sophie said, stirring her tea, "maybe it's time we redecorate the music room." Elena raised an eyebrow. "The music room?" "Yeah. It's just full of old boxes and your journals. We could turn it into something new, fresh, yours." Elena considered it. That room had once been her mother's study. Then for years it had been a locked door, a shrine to what was lost. But now, she nodded slowly. "Let's do it." They spent the weekend pulling boxes from shelves, brushing dust off the past. Old photographs, forgotten letters, sheet music, with Margaret's handwriting in the margins. Elena didn't cry. She smiled. Each object was no longer a wound, just a piece of the story. They painted the walls a soft, creamy white. Sophie hung fairy lights along the ceiling. They placed a new upright piano beneath the window where the light could touch the keys. When it was done, they stood together in the doorway. "It doesn't feel haunted anymore," Elena whispered. "Because you're not haunted anymore," Sophie replied. They named it the room called home. It became their sanctuary, a place for music, for tea, for stories, for silence that didn't hurt anymore, and for laughter, laughter that came freely now without guilt. Elena realized healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant living alongside it, with grace, with music, and with the ones who choose to stay. It happened one rainy morning in October. Elena received a letter with handwriting she didn't recognize, though something about it felt familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, along with a worn photo. The letter was from Esther, her late mother's childhood friend, someone Elena barely remembered but whose name had occasionally appeared in old stories. Dear Elena, I don't know if you remember me. I was Margaret's closest friend when we were both just foolish girls, with big dreams and borrowed shoes. I heard your song. I cried. I thought you might want this picture. It was taken the week before your mother found out she was pregnant with you. She was scared, but she smiled like the whole world was hers. She always loved you. I know she didn't always show it right, but she did. Please believe that. Warmly, Esther Elena held the photo gently. In it, her mother was laughing beside a small lake, barefoot in the grass, hair blowing wildly in the wind. There was something young in her face, a joy Elena had never really seen, a version of Margaret she'd only ever imagined. Sophie found her at the table staring at the photo. Elena? She said softly. Elena looked up, blinking fast. She had a whole life before me. I forget that sometimes. Sophie nodded. We all forget our parents were people once, not just roles. They placed the photo in a small wooden frame and set it on the piano in the room called home. It sat beside a single empty chair, one that Elena had always left untouched, unconsciously, as though waiting for something or someone. Now it didn't feel like it was waiting anymore. It simply was a space, a memory, a reminder that love, however imperfect, still leaves behind something whole. Elena's birthday arrived quietly that year. No big plans, no parties. Just a gentle day wrapped in morning light and the hush of leaves drifting down like soft confetti outside the window. She hadn't celebrated her birthday properly in years, not since the weight of life had made joy feel indulgent. But this year, Sophie insisted. Just dinner, she said, and a surprise. Elena raised an eyebrow. I don't like surprises. That's exactly why I'm doing it. By evening, the house smelled of baked bread, lemon-roasted chicken, and rosemary. Candles flickered on the table. Sophie played soft jazz in the background. After dessert, apple crumble, Elena's favorite, Sophie brought out a small keyboard, sat across from her, and cleared her throat. This is something I wrote, she said, cheeks flushing pink. It's not perfect, but it's yours. Then she played. The melody was gentle, playful, threaded with nostalgia. But the lyrics, that's where it struck. For the years you hid the fire in your chest, for the songs you never sang, for the days you gave and gave and gave, and still came home with hands full of grace. Happy birthday, Mama. You are still becoming. And we're all lucky you stayed. Elena didn't cry right away. She just closed her eyes, letting the music wrap around her like a warm coat on a cold morning. When Sophie finished, Elena took her daughter's hand across the table. No one's ever sung to me like that. You deserved it, Sophie whispered. A long time ago. They sat in silence again, full, not empty, the kind that follows a truth finally spoken. Later that night, Elena wrote in her journal, This year, I was born again. Not younger, not older, just freer. She tucked Sophie's song lyrics into the back pages, knowing she'd read them again when the next quiet birthday rolled around. Elena was folding laundry when the phone rang. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't seen in over a year. Her sister, Marianne. She froze. Marianne, who had disappeared after their last argument, who hadn't replied to letters, missed the funeral, and carried her own grief like a weapon. Elena had made peace with the silence, or so she thought. The phone kept ringing. Sophie appeared in the doorway watching her. "You okay?" Elena nodded slowly and answered. "Hello?" A pause. Then Marianne's voice, older, a little frayed. "Hey, I heard your song. Margaret." It took me apart. Elena didn't speak. Her heart thudded in her chest. "I didn't know you felt all that," Marianne continued. "I didn't know how much you carried. I was angry. I thought you just left me to deal with her alone." "I thought you left," Elena said softly. "I guess we both disappeared." Silence stretched between them, not angry this time, just raw. "I'm sorry," Marianne said, "for how I handled everything, for not showing up. I don't expect anything, I needed to tell you I finally listened." Elena exhaled. For the first time in years, the sound wasn't bitter. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." There was a long pause, then a quiet laugh from Marianne. "Do you still burn toast like a criminal?" Elena laughed. It surprised her. "Worse," she said. "Now I burn soup." It wasn't a perfect reunion, no floodgates of emotion, no promises, but the call ended with something Elena hadn't expected. A plan. "I'm in town next month," Marianne said. "Coffee?" Elena smiled. "Yes. Let's do that." After she hung up, Sophie looked at her curiously. "Well?" "It didn't hurt," Elena said, surprised. "It really didn't hurt, and for once, that was enough." It was late afternoon when Elena and Sophie decided to clear the attic. They weren't searching for anything specific, just chasing dust and time. The air up there was thick with the scent of cedar and something older, like unopened pages in a forgotten book. Boxes towered like silent witnesses. Sophie climbed in first, flashlight in hand. Elena followed, eyes scanning the dimness. "What is all this?" Sophie asked, tugging open a cardboard flap. 20 years of I'll get to it later," Elena replied dryly. They laughed, and for a while it was just that, light-hearted rummaging, until Sophie found a box labeled in neat, elegant handwriting. "Elena, for someday." She looked up. "Mom?" Elena blinked, stunned. "That's my mother's writing." Her hands shook as she opened the box. Inside, a stack of letters, all sealed, a photo album, a velvet pouch. Sophie stepped back, giving Elena space. She watched quietly as her mother picked up the letters, one by one. Each envelope was addressed to a different year. "Elena, on your 30th birthday." "Elena, the day you become a mother." "Elena, when you feel alone." Tears welled in her eyes. She had never known these existed. Her mother had left them behind like time, capsules never delivered. Maybe she had planned to give them later, maybe she forgot, or maybe she simply couldn't face the words when the moment came. Elena opened the one marked, "When you feel alone." "Dear Elena, if you're reading this, I probably failed at something, maybe at everything. But please know I never stopped loving you even when I couldn't show it, even when my voice was sharp or my silence louder than comfort. You were always more than I could say. Love, Mom." Elena closed her eyes, the letter pressed to her heart. "Do you want to read the rest alone?" Sophie asked. Elena shook her head. "No, stay." They sat together in the attic, light pouring in from the small round window. They read every letter, shared every memory. And in that dusty, forgotten room, Elena found something she didn't know she had lost. Her mother's voice. Soft, broken, but real. A voice that had been waiting all along for a second chance to be heard. The first time Elena played the piano in the room called home after reading the letters, something felt different. Not just in her fingers, those were steady, but in her heart. There was a calm there now, a settling of the old storm. She sat at the piano bench and let her hands drift across the keys, not playing any particular song, just feeling. Each note echoed softly, as if the room had become a chamber of memory and healing. Sophie watched from the doorway, silent, her arms crossed loosely. She could hear it too. Not just the music, but the silence between the notes. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of meaning, full of presence. After a while, Sophie walked over and sat beside her mother on the bench. "Play that one again," she said. "The one you were writing a few weeks ago. The one without a name." Elena smiled. "Still doesn't have a name." Sophie nudged her. "That's okay. Maybe it doesn't need one." Elena began to play. The melody was slow, thoughtful, the kind of song you could walk through in your mind and find little pieces of yourself in. Midway through, Sophie gently added, "Harmonies." Her voice was soft, uncertain at first, but then grew stronger as she followed her mother's lead. Their music wove together, not planned, not rehearsed, just felt. When the song ended, they looked at each other and laughed lightly. "It's ours now," Sophie said. They decided to record it, not for release, not for anyone else, but for them. A private piece of proof that healing had happened. That music, like love, could be reborn in the same place where it had once been buried. Later, Elena wrote the title on the case, between the notes. It stayed on the shelf in the room called Home, beside the photo of Margaret beside the empty chair. Because sometimes life's greatest moments aren't loud. They're quiet, and they live in the space between the things we say. One cloudy Sunday afternoon, Elena found herself sitting at her desk, an untouched mug of tea cooling beside her. Sophie was out visiting friends, and the house was still, the kind of stillness that invites unfinished thoughts to resurface. She opened the drawer where she kept old journals and loose pages. Among them was an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed. It was addressed in her own handwriting. To Margaret, never sent. Elena had forgotten it existed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled it open. Inside was a single page. The ink had smudged at some point as though tears had kissed the words before they dried. She began to read. "Mom, I don't know how to talk to you now that you're gone. Maybe I never really knew how when you were alive. There's so much I wish you had said. So much I wish I had said back. Sometimes I hated you for your silence. Sometimes I loved you for your strength. But most of all, I just wanted you to see me. Not as your mistake or your burden or your shadow. Just as me. I forgive you. I hope you forgive me too. I miss you. Elena." The page fell into her lap as she sat still, letting the words echo. She had never needed Margaret to respond anymore. Not after the attic letters, not after the music. But reading this unsent letter felt like tying off the final loose thread of a once-torn fabric. She picked up a clean sheet of paper. This time she wrote a new letter, not one full of pain, but peace. "Dear Mom, I'm okay now. I've learned how to be soft again. I've learned how to stay. Sophie is more like you than she realizes. Brave, brilliant, stubborn as hell. I sing now, I play, I forgive, and I love you. Always, Elena." She folded the new letter, placed it in the same envelope, and slid it back into the drawer. Not to be sent, but to be remembered, because some letters aren't meant for mailboxes. They're meant for hearts. It started with scribbles. Sophie had always written little things, half-songs, poems on napkins, dialogue from daydreams. But Elena never saw the volume of it until one afternoon when Sophie accidentally left her laptop open on the kitchen table. Elena wasn't snooping. She'd just gone to move it when the screen lit up and a title caught her eye. The Shape of E. Her Silence, by S. Hale Curiosity 1. She sat down and began to read. It was a novel, a raw, lyrical, fierce novel. The main character was a girl whose mother had once been a celebrated musician, but had disappeared from public life without explanation. The daughter, bold and emotionally hungry, unraveled her mother's story one song at a time, discovering not only the pain behind the silence, but the immense, quiet love within it. Elena felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just fiction. It was them. filtered through metaphor and metaphor again, but the core was unmistakable. Sophie walked in moments later, saw her mother at the laptop, and froze. "I was going to tell you," she said quickly. "I didn't mean for you to—" Elena stood, up, eyes wet. "Sophie, it's beautiful. You're not mad? Mad?" Elena laughed, teary. "I've never been more proud." Sophie exhaled, her whole body softening. "I submitted it to a competition. I didn't think it would go anywhere." Elena took her hands. "It already has gone somewhere. It came from your heart. That's the farthest place anything can travel from." They hugged for a long time. No music, no words, just warmth. Later that night, they sat side by side on the couch. Elena, for the first time, asked Sophie to read it out loud. And she did, voice steady, words flowing. And in that story within a story, Elena saw something she never expected. The girl she had raised had become a storyteller of healing. 3 weeks later, Sophie received an email that left her speechless. Her novel, The Shape of Her Silence, had been shortlisted for the New Voices Prize, an award for emerging writers under 30. Along with the honor came a request. Would she be willing to appear on a live podcast interview about the book? Sophie paced the kitchen, phone in hand. "I can't," she muttered. "I hate speaking in front of people. I'm not ready." Elena, who had been slicing pears for a tart, looked up calmly. "You already told the story," she said. "This is just letting people hear your voice behind it." "But what if I freeze? What if I say something wrong?" "You won't," Elena said, "because the truth doesn't need polishing. It just needs presence." Sophie stared at her mother, who had once been silent for years, who now said exactly what she meant with perfect simplicity. So Sophie agreed. The night before the interview, they stayed up practicing. Elena asked her mock questions, teased her. When she got too formal, encouraged her to just be herself. And then the day came. Sophie sat before the microphone, heart pounding, hands sweating. The host introduced her with kind words and enthusiasm. Then came the question that mattered most. "Sophie, your book feels deeply personal. There's pain in it, but also healing. Where did that come from?" Sophie took a breath. "It came from watching my mother survive," she said. "From watching her teach me how to feel even when it was hard. We didn't always get it right, but we never stopped trying. That's where the story came from. 2 women learning how to love without fear." There was a silence on the other end. Then the host said softly, "That's one of the most honest answers we've ever had." When the interview ended, Sophie stepped outside into the cool night air. She called Elena immediately. "Well?" Elena asked. "I said the truth," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "And it didn't break me." Elena smiled into the phone. "That's because it made you." The bookstore was quiet, tucked between a florist and a bakery on a sleepy city block. Its windows were lined with handwritten staff picks and fairy lights. A small poster hung on the door. Author reading, S. Hale, The Shape of Her Silence. 6 p.m. Sophie stood inside, heart thudding, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. It wasn't a big event, maybe 20 folding chairs and a tray of lemon bars. But to her, it felt like Carnegie Hall. She glanced around and saw Elena, slipping in through the side. Dressed simply in navy blue, her presence made the room steadier. The host introduced Sophie briefly, then stepped aside. Sophie approached the podium with trembling steps, a marked-up copy of her book in hand. She looked out at the room. A few familiar faces, mostly strangers, but right in the second row, her mother. Calm, proud, present. Sophie opened the book and began. Her voice was soft at first, but each sentence gave her more grounding. The audience leaned in. Her words, once private, floated through the room, shaping a new kind of connection. Near the end, she paused, looked up. "There's a scene," she said, closing the book gently, "where the daughter finally understands why her mother stopped playing music. Not because she gave up, but because life got so loud that silence became her only song." I think a lot of women carry that silence. I wrote this story to give it a voice. The room was utterly still. Then applause broke. Quiet, heartfelt, honest. Afterward, people approached her. Some asked for signatures. Others just said thank you. One woman whispered, "Your story is mine too." When the night ended, Sophie walked with Elena down the street under the glow of the bakery sign. "You were incredible," Elena said. Sophie grinned. "I thought I'd faint." "You didn't, you stood up. You gave something to the world." Sophie turned to her. "I think I understand now what it cost you to be quiet all those years, and what it gave me to watch you find your way back." They reached their car but lingered a moment longer in the night air. Elena looked at her daughter, eyes filled with emotion. "You've built a room for others with your voice," she said. "That's something not even music can always do." Sophie smiled. "You helped me build it." And in that moment, under the city lights, two generations of storytellers stood side by side, no longer separated by silence, but joined by the words they dared to speak. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it arrived with a quiet insistence, buds pushing through soil, trees unfurling new green, and the soft scent of jasmine drifting on the breeze. Elena stood at the edge of the backyard garden, where tangled roots and old memories once ruled. Years ago, this place had grown wild, a mirror to her own internal storm. But now, Sophie stood beside her, trowel in hand, sleeves rolled up, dirt already smudged on her cheek. They were rebuilding it together. "Let's put the lavender near the bench," Sophie said, kneeling down. "It's peaceful there." Elena smiled. "You always liked that spot. I used to come here when I was little and listen for your music through the kitchen window," Sophie said. "I didn't know what you were playing, but it made me feel safe." Elena paused, her heart tugging in that old familiar way. "I was always playing for you," she whispered, "even when I didn't know how to say it." They planted rows of rosemary and daisies, dug up the old rusted trellis and wove in fresh vines. Laughter came easily. Stories flowed between the digging and the watering, and silence, when it came, was no longer heavy. It was shared. At one point, Sophie held up a tiny sprout with excitement. "This one's from the seed packet you gave me years ago." Elena blinked. "You kept it?" "I kept all of it, Mom. Even the things I didn't understand." The sun warmed their backs, and a breeze rustled the newly blooming trees. Later, when the last of the soil had been patted down and the tools rinsed, they sat together on the garden bench. It was quiet, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that held peace. "I think," Sophie said slowly, "we're not just planting flowers. We're planting new beginnings." Elena nodded, reaching for her daughter's hand. "And they're finally blooming."